Good morning, Breakfast with Bacon fans. A lot of us, dare I say, all of us were affected by that thing that happened in 2020 and all the subsequent stuff that happened afterwards. We learned about censorship, we learned about silence, we learned about who could control us, shut us down. We learned that we didn't really have as much power, or it seemed our constitutional rights were taken away. Well, my guest today dealt with that in a very tangible way. His name is Jeffrey Trissell. He wrote the book called Unlocking the Churches. And the tagline in the book is the legal victory, which is always encouraging, the legal victory against California's pandemic era religious discrimination. So he was one of the attorneys who fought on the front lines of this battle, and they won. And that's what's so exciting. So I wanted to just introduce you to my guest, Jeffrey, and also say thank you so much for being a guest on Breakfast with Bacon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm going to ask you why you decided to write this book, but really this legal battle, what caused you to, I mean, a lot of us were irritated, Jeffrey. You don't mind if I call you Jeffrey, if you call me Christine, right?
No problem.
Okay. A lot of us were irritated. We felt like our religious freedoms were squelched, but most of us, I would say, felt powerless. We didn't know what to do. And those who did kind of legally go to battle, many of them lost. So what caused you to feel like I need to fight this, and I need to fight this in the courts?
So I'm a civil litigation attorney in Southern California with a private practice, with a private law firm. There are a lot of us here who are devout Catholics, and we, take our faith very seriously and want to integrate that into our legal practice. So this wasn't like uh, an easy thing for us to decide to do. I mean, when the pandemic hit, um, we bunkered down like the rest of the America, did our best to work remotely and think of how we can follow our bishops, right? Because
Yeah.
we also believe in following the church hierarchy and being obedient. But when Governor Newsom announced the reopening plan in April of 2020, it seemed quite discriminatory. Now thinking back, churches should never have been closed and should have been considered as critical as any other of the critical infrastructure or the essential industries. But even when he started to reopen the non-critical stuff, churches were going to be relegated to far down the line. And at that point, several attorneys in my firm got together and said, this does not seem right, and we need to do something. And we've done a lot of religious liberty cases in the past, but most often they involve a client who comes to us and needs help. And for this one, we kind of felt like
You are the client.
we're going to find a client to stand up. And so we started calling churches, started with the Catholic Church, the Eastern Catholic churches in California, seeing if we can find somebody who's willing to sue and say, I want to open up my church. Because we took this very seriously as, devout Catholic lawyers. And that's when we found our first client, Bishop Hodges of the South Bay Pentecostal Church, who wanted to file a lawsuit. And we filed our first lawsuit, first of three, in early May 2020, and then followed it for a year until we eventually won at the U.S. Supreme Court.
Wait, you started the lawsuit in May of 2020? Like that soon?
Right. There were yes. So the stage two of California's lockdown was going to start on May 1st of 2020. Stage one was the initial lockdown where only certain critical industries were allowed to open. And then stage two was going to start in May, where things like restaurants could reopen. And we said, we are just as essential as restaurants. And there have been a few losses because I think there were earlier lawsuits that my book chronicles that were filed essentially by libertarians who said I should have the right to travel, I should have the right to do anything I want, and they threw in free exercise of religion as an additional claim, but it didn't seem like that was the primary thrust of their lawsuit, and they lost right in late March, early April. And so when we were having this paradigm shift from the original lockdown of about 6 weeks in California to the reopening, the staged reopening, um, that's when we decided we wanted to file our lawsuit at the beginning of that reopening.
Yeah, because I mean, I think so many of us, Jeffrey, were still stunned. I know for me, our churches here in Virginia didn't open until May 24th. So that already was the end of May. I don't know that I would have seen the need for the fight yet at that point. So perhaps for you guys, since your churches weren't opening, but I feel like we were still shell shocked. So I'm so grateful that you had the wherewithal to already recognize the civil liberties losses in terms of our constitutional right, to practice our religion. And again, the fact that you had the not only the insights, but the cojones to fight, because this was a behemoth. This was worldwide. They convinced us, well, of so many. We don't have to go over that, right? That's 5 years ago. They convinced us of things that they were wrong about. So how did you go about securing the victory then? Because other people, as you said, lost. What made this one different?
Well, to go back to something you had just said, I actually wanted to write the book because I was so shell shocked throughout it, right? So what I did in this book is I recount all of the lawsuits filed across the country on religious liberty grounds, some 50 some lawsuits, and then I weave in what happened in our cases. And then I also provide, after I did that for my own personal research to understand what had happened, I realized I needed to have quite a bit of explanation of the legal system so this would be accessible to the average audience. And then as a Catholic, part of the reason I wanted to do the research was to help with my own dealing with what happened, right? And so then there's a lot of spiritual commentary that I also lay on top, in uh, various chapters talking about St. Thomas More and about what it meant to have these different stages in the fight. So the fight itself, it happened within a year, right? It was so quick, and there were very distinct phases. So the first lawsuit we filed was on behalf of South Bay Pentecostal Church, and our basic theme was things are different now, right? In May, we're starting to reopen. It's not, 6 weeks went by pretty fast, but that's enough time for the government to figure out essentially how to get past martial law, to get past just trust us and everybody hunker down and give us a minute to figure it out. We had 6 weeks. That's more than a minute. You need to figure it out by now. And we filed our lawsuit in, beginning of May. And 3 weeks later, we were at the U.S. Supreme Court because we had lost at the district court level and the Ninth Circuit. And we were now asking the U.S. Supreme Court to issue an emergency order allowing our South Bay Pentecostal Church to reopen. And we got a 5-4 loss. And that was a particularly devastating loss because on the one hand, we were so close. The fact that we had 4 justices agreeing with us was very noteworthy. I mean, normally those emergency applications are responded to with a one sentence, the petition for an emergency application is denied, right? Simple as that. You don't get anything else. And so but we got a long opinion by Justice Brett Kavanaugh explaining why we should have won. And we got a short concurring opinion from the Chief Justice explaining why he voted with the liberal bloc. And his Chief Justice Roberts' solo concurring opinion then started the second phase of this, which was from the end of May, early June, for the next 6 months, governments in the United States really had carte blanche to do whatever they wanted because they had Chief Justice Roberts on their side. And so we got some really extreme situations of, Nevada casinos sending one-way plane tickets to people to come to Vegas because the casinos are open. right? But churches were limited to 50%, 50 people in Nevada at the time. And so we were getting more and more vigorous dissents from the justices on the U.S. Supreme Court as more emergency applications were denied, out of Nevada especially. And then in November, in October, we got a very important change on the U.S. Supreme Court, where Justice Ginsburg passed away and was replaced by Justice Barrett. And at that point, of course, we didn't know what would happen, whether, we obviously it was a liberal for conservative, but Justice Barrett has not been the most conservative jurist. But thankfully,
Well, no, nor has the Supreme Court.
The Chief Justice. Yeah.
Thank you, Chief Justice. Neither is he.
But thankfully, that change was sufficient to overturn the 5-4 ruling. So we ended up getting a 6-3 in our favor in what we ended up calling South Bay 2, the second time we went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And Chief Justice Roberts ended up siding with the conservative bloc and ruling that Governor Newsom had to reopen the churches.
If they already, well, maybe this is just a non-legal person question, but if they already ruled no, how did you get to go back and get a 6-3? Did you have to file a whole separate lawsuit or did you say, no, we're going to send this back? Or was it a second church?
You can file, when you file a lawsuit, the initiating document is usually called the complaint, and it lays out your complaint against the government for what they're doing illegally. And in that same lawsuit, you can file an amended complaint or a second amended complaint. So by the time we got back to the court the second time, we were on our second amended complaint, where we were raising new legal theories. And on the one hand, it was all based on free exercise of religion, but different theories as to how the free exercise of religion was being violated. Right. For example, discriminatory enforcement of the lockdown orders, right? With respect to the George Floyd protests, there was I always thought one of the things that you only get when you followed this every day for a year is that in response to our first petition to the U.S. Supreme Court for emergency relief, Governor Newsom immediately buckled. He immediately changed his reopening plan and said that constitutionally protected protests and worship activities can occur, but in no more than a gathering of 100 people. And the very next day, George Floyd was killed. And so we had these protests with thousands and thousands of people erupting in California that were illegal, not just illegal because of a general lockdown, but illegal because of Governor Newsom's order issued just a few days ago saying no more than 100-person protests. It always felt a little frustrating to me that in California, we're loath to give religion special treatment. So it had to be an order about protests and worship. And then after a few days of the George Floyd protests, they very quietly changed the wording of that order. There was no press release or anything to basically say this only applies to indoor gatherings, not outdoor gatherings. But before then, it did apply to outdoor gatherings. So outdoor, so it's, obviously the churches are primarily indoors and rioting is primarily outdoors, but you could also not riot indoors anymore.
Right. Well, and if you had less than 100 people then.
Right.
Right. That's crazy. I mean, all of this is so crazy. So as a Catholic, though, when all of that happened, I got an opportunity to really practice how to articulate our faith to my Protestant brothers and sisters. And so this argument that, okay, you Protestants can get the very same thing you get inside your buildings, inside your, you can do that at home. You can have a house church, because they were like, just gather, just Zoom with people. Zoom, it's great. You can still get what you get at church. I'm like, no, we can't. And so it gave me this great opportunity to explain the Eucharist. Is like all of you Protestants, you have bread and you have Kool-Aid or wine or whatever you do. I said, we can only worship through the hands of a priest who is able to confect the Eucharist. And so first of all, explaining to them, we're the only ones that have the body and blood of Christ. But second of all, we need the priest to do this. We can only receive this when we are in a building. Did any of that help you in your argument saying we have to be together? You are infringing on our religion because this can only be done in the presence of another human, i.e., a priest, thus other people, because we all have to line up for communion. I hope I'm making sense, but was that part of the inherent difference between Catholicism versus all the other religions argument that came up at all?
Unfortunately, in California, we could not get any of the Catholic churches to join our lawsuits. So there's the California Catholic Conference with our 12 dioceses, and they had basically a uniform position, right? All the bishops together, and they didn't want to join the lawsuits. And then there's the Eastern Catholic churches, and I think they were following the lead of the California Catholic Conference. Now, I've gone back and forth as to whether that was on my thinking on that, right? So I'm not from California originally. I moved here for my wife, and we've been here for 10 years, and I do really like it here. But it is definitely enemy territory, right? Like it sometimes it continues to boggle my mind how foreign the way of thinking is of a lot of the people here and the judges, and how very ignorant they are about different ways of viewing reality, right? Like, personally, I've always been fascinated by Eastern thought, by Hindu thought, by Buddhist thought, by just understanding how people view the world through a completely different lens. And so at least I can appreciate what that lens is. And I find here there are a lot of people who really don't. They don't appreciate the concept of like different ways of viewing reality. And so um, when we filed our lawsuits, it was primarily um, two Protestant churches, and then we had an SSPX um, priest with his churches. Now, for him, it was not so much the actual sacraments, which, that's the obvious thing for Catholics, but it was the doctrine of bination, right? Which we don't really deal with as much in the modern church, which is the traditional rule that a priest cannot say more than two masses every Sunday. So for him, he strenuously objected to the concept that the state kept saying was, well, just have more services. If you can only have 100 people per service, then have four or
Right.
five services. And he said, no, we are strictly adhere to the concept that a priest cannot say more than two masses per service.
Right.
And to me, that was like, wow, that's kind of foreign in the sense that I've heard of it, but when I was growing up, I remember it was just like the priest had a waiver every Sunday, right? Because uh, the the Catholic Church is apparently free to give those waivers and does frequently. But the SSPX were adhering to that very strenuously and objecting and trying to get that across to the lawyers on the other side as part of the settlement negotiations to the judges was very difficult. They were just like, well, why is it important? It's like, frankly, I don't really know why it's that important, but it is, right?
Right.
He
Let's
says no
follow
more than
the
two
law.
masses per Sunday, right? And trying to get that in for the South Bay Pentecostal Church, it was about um, yeah, about gathering in person and about, I mean, for them, the sacrament of baptism is very, very important. I guess in the Pentecostal tradition, that is. And you can't do baptism over Zoom, you know. And even the concepts of like Gnosticism, right? People take it for granted so much that the true person is their mind and soul and not their body. That seems like it's a very prevalent, modern prevalent way of thinking. And trying to explain to people that, well, no, actually, we believe that in my faith tradition that the body and mind and soul are all combined, and you can't really divorce the two. And so a Zoom meeting is not adequate. It doesn't really achieve what we're trying to achieve. Just even explaining that to judges seemed like it was a hard sell.
Yeah.
Um, and they would have a hard time even appreciating the concepts. Um, and so back to what I was saying earlier. So how hard of a sell it was to judges in California made me wonder whether the Catholic Church was right. If the only way to win is at the US Supreme Court and you're going to lose in the lower courts all along the way, maybe you should keep your head down. Because after the first loss of the US Supreme Court, the 5-4 loss, the tone completely shifted. It went from these are churches who are trying to reopen to these are churches who are trying to avoid being prosecuted because they have reopened, right? So we defended Grace Community Church in our second lawsuit, where the County of Los Angeles was coming after them and trying to shut them down, trying to get ruinous fines and penalties imposed because Grace Community Church said, we're reopening, we don't care what you say. And in fact, the end of the book ends with a case that is still ongoing, where the County of Santa Clara had prosecuted a church seeking approximately $5 million in fines and penalties, and they're still fighting over it, 5 years later.
Wow. Well, I mean, obviously this is a victory. And that's what it says in the book. Is going to explain how that is. But going into the more deeper concepts, I told you before we went on the air, and many of the people who follow me know that I have a standards ministry, a 501c3, Sacred Standards, that we fight for the validity of marriage when the whole world is telling us, move on, move on. He divorced you. You're free to go. Well, the church doesn't teach that. The church teaches, no, you're married until death, which is why the Catholic Church specifically has the process of annulment to check and see, was it really a valid marriage at that point? So the 501c3 is basically people who are saying, no, there's no such thing as the second marriage. It's fake, of course, assuming your spouse is still alive. And St. Thomas More actually fought that same battle. He was very much persecuted for telling the king, standing up to him. Basically, he was standing up for truth. And so when in the book it mentions this, that, standing up for your beliefs in the face of tyranny is a persecution that we need to take. I think it said, do not remain silent in times of persecution. A faith worth dying for is a faith worth living for. And so when I saw that you really had those same beliefs, it's like, we've got to stand up for our faith, because if we don't, it will be taken from us and people will be confused about what is true, what is not true. And that's actually one of the things that brings people closer to the church. People watching St. Thomas More made them stronger in their faith. And I find the same thing too with my standards ministry. People watch them and go, I really believe that. And more people then stand for their faith, stand for the truth of marriage, stand for, the same thing you did, for the truth of my religious beliefs. So as a man of faith, I don't know if you can separate this from the legalities because you're a lawyer, it's who you are. What did this mean for you personally as a man of faith, deep Catholic faith?
So I talk about Thomas More a lot in the book, just because as a Catholic lawyer, he's the patron saint of lawyers, and so I've read several of his biographies, and you always try to glean spiritual lessons from the patron saint of your profession. And there were really two important themes I made regarding Thomas More in the book. And the second one is one I've been thinking about more lately, which is when Thomas More went to was imprisoned and beheaded for refusing to swear the oath of supremacy, and acknowledge King Henry VIII as the head of the church in Rome, who could give himself a divorce and recognize Anne Boleyn as the new queen. Only one bishop stood next to him, right? Bishop John Fisher. And on the one hand, I tend to think of that as a condemnation of the church, right? That the bishops were
Cowardly?
they were cowardly, yes. But on the other hand, I also think it was not necessarily cowardice as much as um, a lack of preparedness, right? Like this was so surprising. The what is the break was a very strange thing that they didn't know how to react to, right? It was like COVID for us. It was just like, wait, what's happening? What's going on? What do we do? And they looked around and they just followed everybody else, right? But the second time around, right? So after King Henry VIII, his daughter Mary, Queen of Scots, became the queen, and tried to reinstate the Catholic Church and bring the England back into the Catholic fold, and that failed, right? Unfortunately, but after her reign, almost all of the Catholic bishops in England stood up and were martyred, and so they learned the lesson, and 20 years later, they basically said, okay, we learned our lesson, and now we're going to stand up, and they suffer the consequences for it. And I think that's one of the things I've been taking from the pandemic. I feel like there's a new era in the Catholic Church, right? We have a new presidency, we have a new pope, things have changed. And I think part of the reason alongside the changes, there seems to me at least to be a renewed sense of hope. And I think it's because people looked around at what happened in the pandemic and how we had rolled over too easily to the trampling of our religious rights, saw that happen, and now we're pushing back. And at least I'm feeling optimistic that we're going to have positive change in the future because people learned the lesson. And if we well, at least I like to be optimistic and hopeful, and see the good in people. So I'm hoping that people saw what I saw in this book, in this year, and decided to push back. Even if they didn't join the fight like I did. I mean, I felt like a certain degree I was dragged into it. Didn't I wouldn't have necessarily, you know, done anything unless I was just in the right place in the right time. But I definitely drew lessons from it that I've been able to apply going forward.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm actually the most optimistic person I know as well. And I actually did think, cowards at first, but then I thought, maybe there's a lot of wise men in there, or wise men and women then in the church as a whole, but let's stick with the bishops, who, okay, maybe I'm going to keep my mouth shut so that when I need to speak, they're like creating this tapestry of what am I looking for? Like an underground
Hmm.
communication with each other, so that when they need to, they will be able to speak up again. Because if they had spoken up right away, who knows? I mean, it might have been good, might have ended things, but they might have all gotten their heads chopped off, and we wouldn't have had as many people to fight. Maybe only cowards would have stood up after that. I doubt it, because usually when stuff like that happens, it emboldens people, makes them stronger. But I do agree with you. I do believe people are going, oh, not again, not on my will. I've actually seen some of the bishops who have said, now, if that ever happens again, know that I will never shut down the churches in my diocese. So I do think we've learned from it, just like we've learned from the Holocaust in Germany. Okay, are we going to, let's look for these signs again. So I don't necessarily think persecution's always bad, but there are such really good things that can come from persecution. And in the Beatitudes, the Lord himself said, blessed are the persecuted. And he doesn't speak, what is it? He's not flourishing and, just kind of analogy. You're blessed if you're persecuted. He meant it. If you are persecuted, you are blessed, because the reward is going to be great for accepting that persecution, because not everybody's strong enough to receive persecution. All that said, it takes people like you to be a fighter against it, to call it to the attention of others. So let me end by asking one, not a full ending, yet two more questions, but what is the greatest thing you learned? What is the greatest thing that Jeffrey Trissell became or learned because of the whole experience of living through this and also fighting and winning too?
I guess what I learned was you have to be willing to go down fighting. So, um, to a certain degree, the religious liberty cases that I've handled are very, very tough because when you're dealing with general civil litigation, it's usually just about money. So if you're on the losing side of a case, you can look at it and say, okay, you did this thing, it was bad. uh, your basically job is to help negotiate a fair settlement that so your client has to pay the least amount possible that's fair, right? But you want to get, you just want to negotiate a fair resolution and get out of the case because you can tell that your client is not on the right side of this dispute. When you deal with religious liberty, there's no negotiating half measures. It's, all or nothing, and nothing means, well, then you can't go to church, right? Which is life or death kind of stuff. I mean, it's really um, hits a lot closer to home.
Mhm.
And so when we were dealing after the first loss of the U.S. Supreme Court, and then we were dealing with the prosecutions where it was Santa Clara County, Ventura County, Los Angeles County coming after churches and basically saying, you shut down or we are going to issue ruinous fines, place the pastors under house arrest. You know, it just it I did not have to deal with that in any of my cases prior to then. It's not something it's part of my legal practice. But you quickly realize that, yeah, I am willing to go down fighting for the right to go to church. Like that is something that
Yeah,
even if
I'm
the
willing to die for,
writing on the
basically.
wall and I think we're going to lose, I'm willing to stand with my clients for this. Um, and thankfully we navigated through this and did win. But until justice, I mean, we had no idea that Justice Ginsburg was going to pass away, and
God
so
did. Okay.
for during that summer, it was much more of a willingness to introspection and thinking about what it is that you're willing to really stand for and to fall with if you have to.
God bless you for that. Thank you. Thank you for fighting. And thanks for writing the book so other people can see it, get encouraged by it, and then perhaps even learn from it as Catholics and as lawyers. This is how we're going to fight for this. And do not give up. And that's what I tell my standers. Do not give up. You are on the winning side because it does say, in the end, my Sacred Heart will triumph. In the end, the gates of hell shall not prevail. So we have to remember that we are fighting a spiritual battle and we have to use whatever weapons are at our disposal, whether they are spiritual weapons, legal weapons, physical weapons. We need to be able to keep fighting and say, Lord, I'll give you everything you have. I'm willing to fight. So the outcome, I always say this, do only what you know to be right and give the consequences to God. That's all we can do. That's all we can do. I would love for people to get this book. Again, it's called Unlocking the Churches, the Legal Victory Against California's Pandemic Era Religious Discrimination. You can get it at sophiainstitute.com. And Sophia has been very, very good to me and send me great authors coming here. I think that especially as Catholics, we need to read books that really speak to the Catholic faith, especially in this day and age where religion is well, it's being fought against tooth and nail. We don't know what is true, what is not true. So I think Sophia does a great job of putting these books out that will help us stay true to our faith. I always ask my guests, name one thing you'd have our listeners do differently as a result of something they heard today. What would you say to that?
Uh, I would actually say spend more time praying and less time dealing with the culture war issues. And that way, when a culture war issue actually comes to your front door, you'll be prepared for it.
That's a good answer. That's actually a very good answer. Yeah. Get prayed up, put on the spiritual armor, and prayer is what's going to get you there. The breastplate of righteousness, the sword of truth, the shield of faith, all that stuff. You get that from praying. So again, get this book at sophiainstitute.com. Link is right below in the show notes. And also go and like and subscribe to my channel. Go to my website, breakfastwithbacon.com. Follow me right here on this channel. Follow me as well on Rumble, Instagram, I forget all of them, Facebook, TikTok. I'm new to TikTok now. So I would be honored because I am, like my guest, Jeffrey Trissell, I do believe in fighting. And as those of you who've been following me for a while know, my goal has always been to save 1 million marriages before I die, which is really the same as saving 1 million souls. Because if you save a marriage, you're saving that soul. So I think that's all we had to talk about. Let's see how good we can do in bringing the show to a close. Jeffrey, you think you got this? You might have this, right? Let's see how good he is. I'm Dr. Christine Bacon. You've been watching Breakfast with Bacon, and I'd like to remind you always to live your life.
Sunny side up.
He's got it.